I, Jonas Henriksen, reject you, Tora Hevroy, as my fated mate. The words hit the cold stone hall like a death sentence. And for a single, shattering heartbeat, every wolf in the Iron Vale Great Hall waited to see if Tora would finally break. She had been holding her clipboard when it happened. That was the cruelest part. She had been checking the placement of the solstice candles, making sure the third table from the left had the correct floral arrangement for the Western Alpha's delegation, when the bond snapped into existence so violently that the clipboard hit the floor, and she didn't even hear it land. One moment she was an archivist doing her job. The next, every cell in her body oriented toward Jonas Henriksen like a compass finding north, and she understood with devastating, total clarity that the universe had decided, without consulting her, that he was hers. He had felt it too. She watched it cross his face from across the hall, that flicker of raw, involuntary recognition, the way his body stilled and his chin lifted, and his eyes found her in the crowd with an accuracy that had nothing to do with sight. For one devastating second, the universe aligned. Then Jonas looked at Britta Falk, the silver-blonde daughter of the Western Alpha, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow, her gown worth more than Tora made in a year. He looked at his father, High Alpha Eric, standing at the head of the room with an expression carved from the same cold stone as the walls. The unspoken message passed between them in less than a breath. Jonas's jaw set. He raised his voice. The severing of the bond was physical. Tora felt it as a blade drawn through the center of her chest, a tearing so sudden and thorough that she tasted copper and understood, distantly, that she had bitten through her own lip. 200 wolves went absolutely silent. 200 wolves watched, with the particular fascination of predators witnessing something wounded, to see what she would do. Tora Hevroy pressed her tongue to the blood on her lip. She straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. I, Tora Hevroy, accept your rejection, Jonas Henriksen. May the bond dissolve cleanly. May we never be bound again. She bent and retrieved her clipboard from the floor. She turned toward the door. She didn't give them the satisfaction of watching her face. She never made it to the door. The torches lining the great stone hall guttered all at once, every single flame bending sideways as if caught in a wind that existed only in this room, only in this moment, and then died. The hall plunged into a darkness broken only by the fireplace and the cold winter light bleeding through the high windows. The flagstones shuddered. A pressure dropped over the assembled wolves like a fist closing around the room, ancient and absolute and utterly without mercy, and 200 wolves, warriors, nobility, the highest-ranked members of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, sank to their knees as if the weight of it had simply pressed them down. The great oak doors exploded inward. In the threshold, haloed by the winter dark, stood a man so large he nearly filled the frame. He wore battle-dark armor embossed with a snarling wolf across the chest, a fur mantle across his shoulders that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the cold. His hair was the color of pale winter wheat, his jaw shadowed with several days of rough growth, and his eyes, when they swept the room in a single, slow, methodical assessment, were the precise Arctic blue of ice over deep water.
Arvid Solberg,
Alpha King of the Northern Realm. His gaze moved through the hall, past the kneeling nobles, past the appended solstice arrangements and the extinguished torches, past Jonas Henriksen, who had gone the color of ash. It swept the room with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and all the power in it, until it found the one thing it was looking for. It found Tora. His Arctic eyes locked onto hers. Something passed over his face, something vast and certain and barely leashed, and the pressure in the room doubled. "Who," he said, very quietly, "dares reject my queen?" Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. He was not supposed to be here. That was the first thing Arvid Solberg had thought when the scent hit him. The sharp, metallic snap of a severed bond cutting through the cold winter air like a blade through silk, carrying with it an undertone of pain so acute it registered as physical even through two stone walls and a closed door. He had been in the antechamber reviewing border reports with Commander Leaf, a routine inspection of the Iron Veil Pact's Northern Treaty compliance. Nothing that required his personal presence, and nothing that should have taken more than 4 hours. He had been about to leave. Then the bond snapped. Her bond. And every rational thought in Arvid Solberg's considerable mind simply ceased to function. He did not remember crossing the antechamber. He did not remember his hand meeting the oak doors, or the doors giving way before him. He was simply outside, and then he was inside, and the hall full of kneeling wolves and guttering torches and the weight of his own alpha fury pressing outward like a shockwave was already a thing that had happened, and in the center of all of it, her face. She was not what he had expected. He was not sure, later, what he had expected. He had been aware for 3 years that somewhere in the northern territories his fated mate existed, had felt her as a distant warmth at the edge of his consciousness, like a fire glimpsed through a winter window. He had expected someone who looked like a queen. He had expected someone who already knew what she was. He had not expected a woman in a steel-gray dress, blood on her lip, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, with eyes that looked directly back at him without flinching. Most people, when Arvid Solberg directed the full weight of his attention at them, found something else to look at. It was not a conscious act of intimidation. It was simply the effect of being what he was, standing where he stood, carrying 37 years of absolute authority in every line of his body. Even his own council members tended to find the middle distance suddenly interesting. Tora Hevroy looked back at him. There was blood on her mouth and tears she had not shed banked behind her eyes, and the severed end of a mate bond raw and open in her chest, and she looked directly at the Alpha King of the Northern Realm, as if she was simply waiting to see what happened next. Something in Arvid's chest cracked open. He turned his gaze, slowly, deliberately, with all the patience of a man deciding the appropriate measure of a sentence, to Jonas Henriksen. Jonas was kneeling with the rest of them. He was a well-made man, Arvid noted distantly, tall, broad-shouldered, with the golden coloring and easy arrogance of someone who had never once in his life been told that what he wanted did not matter. He was, in all measurable ways, exactly the sort of man who became a high alpha's heir. He was also, at this precise moment, the color of old ash, and the arrogance was doing something complicated and unsuccessful on his face that might have been the beginning of realization. Arvid walked toward him. He did not hurry. The hall stayed silent around him. No one breathed, no one shifted. 200 wolves pressed to their knees by the weight of an alpha fury that had moved past rage into something colder and more dangerous than rage. Behind him, he was aware of Tora, the new bond pulling taut between them, warm and insistent against the raw edge of the severed one, asking to be recognized. He kept his eyes on Jonas. He stopped 4 feet away. He looked down. "Tell me," Arvid said. His voice in the silence was conversational, almost pleasant, the way a blade can look like a mirror before it turns. "What is your name?" Jonas swallowed. His throat moved visibly. Around them, no one in the hall had the temerity to even breathe. Jonas Henriksen, he said, heir to the Iron Vale pack. Sir. Jonas Henriksen. Arvid let the name sit in the cold air for a moment. You recognized your fated mate this evening. It was not a question. Jonas's jaw tightened fractionally, and Arvid noted the direction his eyes wanted to move, toward Britta Falk, who was also kneeling somewhere to the left, and the way he controlled it. Smart enough to know that direction would be the wrong one. Not smart enough to have applied that judgment 40 minutes ago. I did, Jonas said. And you rejected her. Publicly. Before your full assembly. The match was unsuitable. A thread of recovered pride in the voice. Not arrogance yet, but its ghost. Tora Hevroy holds no rank, no bloodline, no territory. As heir to Iron Vale, my mate selection must reflect the political. I did not ask for your reasoning, Arvid said. The pleasantness in his voice had not changed in any measurable way. The temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees. I asked you to confirm what you did. Silence. Jonas's throat moved again. I rejected her. Yes. You did. Arvid turned then, a slow, deliberate movement, and looked at Tora. She had not moved from where she stood. She was still holding the clipboard. Her chin was still lifted. The blood on her lip had dried to a faint dark crescent, and the look in her eyes when they met his was something he had no immediate word for. It was not hope, exactly, and not defiance, and not relief. It was something more careful than all of those. The look of someone who had learned a very long time ago not to trust good things arriving suddenly. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Long enough that it was not accidental. Long enough that every wolf in the room understood what it meant. Then he turned back to Jonas. She is mine, he said. Quiet. Absolute. The words did not require volume. They had the quality of a law being enacted. The bond you severed was a severing of your own fortune, not hers. She was never diminished by what you did here tonight. The diminishment was yours entirely. You have shown 200 witnesses that when the universe gave you something irreplaceable, you weighed it against political convenience and found it wanting. He looked at Jonas for another long moment, not with heat, not with rage, but with the particular cold clarity of a man who has already decided and is simply giving the other party time to understand the decision. You will stand, he said, and you will walk to the center of this hall, and you will apologize to your future queen. You will do this once, and you will mean it, and it will not be sufficient. Nothing you could say tonight would be sufficient. But you will do it because I am giving you one opportunity to conduct yourself with whatever dignity you still possess before I begin the formal inquiry into how the most competent wolf in this pack came to be housed in a staff attic and paid a secretary's wage while her work held your financial infrastructure together. You have 30 seconds to decide whether you'd like to take that opportunity. The hall was so silent that the fire in the great hearth was audible. Jonas Henriksen, heir to Iron Vale, golden and golden arrogant and utterly certain of his own worth since the moment of his birth, rose on legs that were not entirely steady, walked across the flagstones, and looked at Tora Hevroy. His face was not a pleasant thing to watch. Pride and shame do ugly work together. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was low and rough and about a quarter of what it needed to be, but it was there. What I did tonight it was wrong. I was wrong. Tora looked at him. Her expression did not change. She did not nod, did not accept, did not offer the grace of visible forgiveness. She simply received the words, received them with the still, flat, devastating patience of someone who had been told they were nothing and had decided, a long time ago, that the opinions of lesser people were not her concern. Then she turned to Arvid. He crossed the distance between them, and when he stopped before her, close enough that the new bond rang between them like a struck bell, he did not perform anything. He did not make a show of it. He simply looked at her, this woman with the blood on her lip and the clipboard in her hands and the spine of something ancient and unbending, and said, quietly, for her alone, "I am sorry I was not here sooner." Something moved in Tora's eyes. Just a flash of it, there and gone, controlled before it could fully arrive. But it was there. Behind them, the torches reignited. Every single one, all at once, flooding the hall with warm gold light, and the pressure that had held 200 wolves to their knees released like a drawn breath finally exhaled. The room stirred. Arvid did not look at it. He was looking at her. "You weighed her against Timberites," he said, and his voice carried this time, carrying back through the hall to where Jonas stood, and beyond him to the kneeling assembly, and beyond them to the stone walls and the wolf banners, and the 200 years of iron-veiled tradition that had apparently failed to produce a single person capable of recognizing what was standing in their midst, and found her wanting. "I will give you one chance, to prepare a formal accounting of every resource this pack has taken from Tora Hevroy across the duration of her service. Every unpaid contribution, every appropriated intellectual labor, every honor withheld. You have until morning, because before I dismantle everything your family has built, I intend to know the exact cost of what they stole."
Silence.
Arvid offered Tora his arm. She looked at it for one beat, one single beat of calculated assessment, of a woman measuring whether to trust the thing being offered, and then she tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow with the quiet, controlled composure of someone who has simply decided. They walked out of the Iron Veil Great Hall together. Behind them, not one wolf moved until the sound of their footsteps had faded entirely. Chapter 2. Tora had always known, in the abstract, that her quarters were inadequate. She had known it the same way she knew that the Iron Veil accounting practices were a decade out of date, that the Eastern Treaty renewal was being chronically mishandled, and that the catering supplier for the solstice events had been overcharging by 22% for the last 3 years. These were things she was aware of. She had simply never had the standing to address any of them, and so she had filed the knowledge neatly in the category of things that were true and unchangeable and not worth spending emotional resources on. She had not anticipated standing in her doorway, with the Alpha King of the Northern Realm filling up the narrow corridor behind her, watching him take in the room. He was very still. The room was it was what it was. A narrow cot against the far wall, the mattress perfectly made with the mechanical precision of someone who did not permit themselves the luxury of untidiness. A desk that was more accurately a stratum of organized information, ledgers stacked at exact angles, correspondence sorted by urgency, a second set of Iron Veil's financial records maintained in Tora's own hand because the official records had gaps she had never been able to stop herself from filling in. A single window in the slanted ceiling, the lower left pane cracked across and patched with a strip of wax paper that had been there so long it had gone translucent with age. The overhead beam was low enough that a man of Arvid's height would have to duck to cross the room, which she noted he was careful to do without calling attention to. There was a cold draft coming from somewhere near the baseboard that she had reported 3 times. Arvid looked at the wax paper in the window. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the narrow cot, the single hook on the wall that served as her wardrobe, the oil lamp that was her only light source. He looked at all of it with an expression that did not perform anything, no theatrical horror, no pointed pity, and then he said, "How long have you lived here?" 6 years. Tora moved to her desk and began efficiently transferring the most critical ledgers into her satchel. Since they promoted me to head archivist, the previous archivist had a room in the main wing, but they converted it to a guest suite for the Western delegation visits. They gave your predecessor's room to guests. The Western delegation visits 4 times a year. She added the treaty files. It made logistical sense. And no one gave you the corresponding increase in accommodation. I was adequately housed. The satchel was nearly full. She moved to the hook on the wall, took down her winter coat and her one good dress, the dark blue one, the one she wore for council presentations, the only piece of clothing she owned that had been purchased rather than made. I didn't require anything elaborate. Arvid was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him watching her move through the room, packing with the practiced economy of someone who has done it quickly and quietly before, who has learned not to be attached to places, because places can be taken. When she finally looked up, he was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her with that particular quality of attention she was still not used to, the kind that was not evaluating but simply present.
Seeing.
They exploited you,
He said.
They employed me. Tora. Her name in his mouth did something to the new bond, a soft, warm pressure, like a hand pressed to a bruise, not painful, but deeply felt. She stopped packing. The most competent person in this pack was housed in a drafty attic and paid wages a junior filing clerk would have refused. They gave you a broken window and took 6 years of financial architecture in return, and they called it employment because they knew you would accept it. That is not employment. That is a very particular kind of theft dressed in professional language, and I will not allow you to defend it. Tora stood very still with her coat folded over her arm. The wind moved through the gap near the baseboard. The oil lamp flickered. I built things here that mattered, she said finally.
Her voice was even.
She had no practice at all with being defended. None. And the evenness was the only armor she had. The work was real. The work was mine. What they paid me for it doesn't change what it was. He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted very slightly in his expression, not softening exactly, but recognizing.
No.
He agreed. It doesn't. The work was yours. It will remain yours. And you'll be compensated for it appropriately before I'm finished with Iron Veil. But that's tomorrow's business. Tonight, I am asking you to leave this room and not come back to it. She looked around the attic one last time. 6 years of cold drafts and careful ledgers, and a broken window patched with wax paper. 6 years of making herself useful, and hoping it was enough. The clipboard was still in her hand. She realized distantly. She had carried it all the way from the Great Hall, through the rejection and the arrival of the Alpha King and the long walk across the Iron Veil estate to this cold little room, and she had not once set it down. She set it down now. She left it on the desk among the ledgers and the filing systems and the organized evidence of 6 years of unrecognized work, and she walked out the door and did not look back. The convoy assembled in the Iron Veil courtyard an hour before midnight. 6 black vehicles bearing the silver wolf sigil of the Northern Realm, Arvid's personal guards standing at parade rest in the cold, their breath misting in the torchlight. Word had traveled through the pack with the particular speed of shocking news, and there were faces in the upper windows of the main hall when Tora descended the front steps with her satchel, though no one had come out to see her go. No one except Sigrid. Her best friend was waiting at the bottom of the steps, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her round face carrying an expression that was doing its best to be controlled and not quite succeeding. Sigrid had been in the hall tonight. She had seen all of it. She had been one of the 200 wolves pressed to their knees when Arvid Solberg walked through the door, and Tora knew, without needing to ask, that Sigrid had spent the intervening hour equal parts terrified and ferociously satisfied on her behalf. "You're really going," Sigrid said. "I'm really going." Sigrid looked at Arvid Solberg, who was standing at the lead vehicle with Commander Leaf, his back deliberately turned to give them privacy, which Tora noted and did not know what to do with. Sigrid looked back at Tora.
"He's very large," she said.
"He is. And he came in and dropped the entire pack to their knees because of you." "He came in on a council inspection," Tora said. "The timing was..." "Tora." Sigrid grabbed her hand. Her grip was fierce, knuckle-white. "That man felt your bond break through 2 stone walls and chose you in front of everyone Jonas had tried to impress. Don't you dare explain that away into logistics." Tora looked at their joined hands. She breathed in the cold winter air and the smell of the torches and the distant sound of wolves who were still processing the evening inside the main hall, and she did not explain it away. She held Sigrid's hand instead, for a long moment, before she let go. "Come to Frosthold," she said. "When you can. Try to keep me away." They drove through the night. Tora sat in the rear vehicle, and Arvid sat beside her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be polite about the distance, and said nothing for the first 2 hours, which was precisely the right amount of nothing. She watched the winter forest move past the windows, black trees against blacker sky, and felt the new bond settling into her chest with the careful, patient quality of something that understood it was not yet trusted and was willing to wait. She fell asleep somewhere in the 3rd hour. She was aware, distantly, of her head tilting toward his shoulder and staying there, and of the fact that he did not move. She woke to pale gray dawn over white fields, the vast, snow-covered flatlands that announced the northern reaches of the realm, and to the first sight of Frosthold keep rising from the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built, its dark stone towers catching the early light, its walls running along a ridge above a frozen river. It was enormous. It was beautiful in the way that very old, very serious things are beautiful, not ornamental, not for show, simply and completely itself. The convoy rolled through the outer gates and into the keep's main courtyard, and as Tora stepped out into the cold, the front doors of Frosthold opened, and a woman descended the stone steps toward her. Older, perhaps 60, with silver hair wound close to her head, and the particular bearing of someone who has been the center of competence in a complicated household for a very long time. She looked at Tora with eyes that were not assessing. She had clearly already assessed and reached her conclusion and moved past it, but warm. Simply, unambiguously warm. "Queen Tora," she said, and her voice was rich and certain, a voice that had spent decades knowing what it was talking about. She took Tora's hands in both of hers. "I am Astrid. I run Frosthold's household. We have been waiting a very long time for you." Tora stood in the pale winter dawn, her satchel over her shoulder and the remnants of last night's pain still faintly present in her chest, and heard herself called queen for the first time. It sat oddly. It sat like a garment cut for someone else, someone who didn't know about broken windows and wax paper patches and the particular loneliness of being the most useful person in a room and the least considered one. She would need time to grow into it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she could account for, and followed Astrid through the doors of Frosthold Keep into the warm, stone-scented dark within. Chapter 3. Not everyone bowed. She had known they wouldn't. She had known it the same way she knew the winter was going to be long and the northern roads treacherous, and the political dynamics of a sudden royal mate claim complicated, as a fact requiring management, not a wound requiring tending. By the time Astrid had shown her to her chambers, enormous, south-facing, with a working fireplace and a window that was definitively not patched with wax paper, and she had slept 4 hours and washed and changed and presented herself for her first morning at Frosthold, she had already mentally categorized the court into 3 groups: those who would accept her, those who would eventually accept her, and those who would not accept her until she made it structurally impossible for them not to. Commander Leaf fell into the 3rd category. He was a square, gray-haired, weathered man who had served 3 generations of Solberg Alphas and held the opinion, stated plainly to Tora within the first 6 minutes of their acquaintance, that the mate bond was a biological fact but proved nothing about fitness for authority, that Frosthold's security protocols were not written for the comfort of newcomers, and that any review of existing administrative systems by someone who had been in residence for less than 12 hours was respectfully premature. He had not said it disrespectfully. That was the interesting part. He had said it the way a man says a thing he genuinely believes, with no interest in performing disdain, and no awareness that he was being rude, which meant Tora understood immediately that he was not hostile so much as simply rigorous, and rigor she could work with. Lady Gunhild was different. Lady Gunhild Voss was 63, extraordinarily well-preserved, and had served as the social architect of Frosthold's court for 2 decades. She had also, Tora learned from Astrid in careful, diplomatic language, spent the last 3 years managing the delicate alliance between the Solberg line and the family of Lady Solveig Haas, Arvid's intended, deceased 18 months ago in a carriage accident on the Northern Pass, and navigating the political fallout of that loss. She had built a structure. She had invested significantly in that structure. And Tora, arriving overnight from a staff attic, was an unranked, unblooded disruption to everything Lady Gunhild had carefully maintained. She did not say any of this, naturally. She was perfectly civil at breakfast, perfectly, precisely, icily civil, the kind of civil that requires significant skill to produce, and is absolutely not the same as warmth, and her eyes followed Tora with the measuring patience of someone deciding how much of a problem this was going to be. Tora smiled at her pleasantly and ate her breakfast and asked Astrid afterward for access to the Northern Realm's administrative ledgers. She found it in 37 hours. 37 hours of close review. She had always been fast, had always been able to hold the architecture of a financial system in her mind the way other people held maps, understanding the territories and the roads and the places where the road should go but didn't, and she found it a systematic pattern of underreported revenue from the Northern Realm's timber and mineral contracts, beginning 4 years ago, redirected through a secondary account under the name of a supply management firm that, when she traced its registration, resolved into a shell entity with ties to Frosthold's internal administrative office. She ran the numbers twice. Then she compiled the documentation. She brought it to Arvid in his council chamber, set it on the table before him with the quietly satisfied precision of someone presenting completed work, and watched him look at it. He looked at it for a long time. His expression was very still. "This has been running for 4 years," he said. "Approximately. The pattern is consistent from the 3rd quarter of the year before last, though there are anomalies in the earlier records that suggest the methodology was being tested at a smaller scale for at least a year prior." She had made a separate file for those anomalies. She set it beside the first. The steward responsible for the secondary account is Domin Wolf. His appointment was sponsored by Lady Gunhild's household. A long silence. Arvid looked at the files and then at her. How much? She told him. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, his expression had resolved into the particular cold clarity she was learning was his version of controlled fury, not hot, not demonstrative, simply airless and absolute. You've been here less than 2 days. The patterns were not well hidden. She was being generous. The patterns were an embarrassment. Someone had been confident enough in their position not to bother hiding it properly. I think the intent was that no one would look closely enough to find it, rather than that it would withstand scrutiny if examined. No one has looked closely enough to find it. In 4 years. No one with the right combination of access and inclination.
She paused.
I had both. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was more than the clinical assessment she was accustomed to receiving, something that registered her specifically, not her usefulness, but her, and had some feeling about what it saw. She did not know what to do with that, so she looked at the files instead. Wolf was removed from his position that afternoon. Lady Gunhild came to find Tora the following morning. She found her in the archive wing, which Tora had quietly adopted, drawn to it inevitably, the way she was always drawn to wherever the records were kept, the way the records were always the truest picture of how a place actually functioned beneath its own performed narrative. She was in the middle of a cross-referenced review of the Northern Treaty renewals when she became aware of Lady Gunhild in the doorway. She waited. I did not sponsor Wolf knowing what he was doing, Lady Gunhild said. Her voice was precise and uninflected. She was a woman who had spent 60 years not being imprecise or deflecting, and she applied both qualities even to things that cost her. I sponsored him because he was my late husband's nephew, and he needed a position. I did not monitor the position adequately. That is my failing. I know, Tora said. Lady Gunhild's eyes narrowed fractionally. Not with displeasure, with recalibration. You reviewed my correspondence connections as well. I reviewed everything, Tora said. I needed to understand the full picture before I could determine accountability accurately. Your correspondence showed no awareness of the fraud. Your financial records show no benefit from it. You are not implicated. I see. A pause. Lady Gunhild looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, without the careful social distance she had been maintaining. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone easier to dismiss. She said it without particular apology, which Tora respected. Someone whose primary qualification was the king's regard for her. Tora went back to her treaty review. That is his regard for me, she said. I come with additional features. There was a silence, and then very quietly, something that might have been in another woman with a different face, a laugh. Lady Gunhild left without further comment, and Tora worked through the afternoon, and in the archive wing of Frosthold, Keep the Northern Light came down through high windows onto rows of organized records, and she realized distantly, more comfortable than she had been in 6 years. Commander Leaf found her in the training yard at dawn 3 days later. She had gone there at first light to work through her morning run, and found instead 40 of his wolves in full practice, and had stopped to watch, because she always watched things that were organized well, and this was organized exceptionally. He appeared at her elbow. The wolf money, he said, without preamble. How long would it have taken us to find it internally? Tora considered this honestly. Years, possibly. The methodology was designed for the existing oversight structure. It would only be found by someone working from outside that structure's assumptions. A grunt. Then, the Eastern Treaty anomalies. I had flagged those 3 years ago. No one acted on my flag. You were right to flag them, she said. The irregularities in the logging concession language date to the original negotiation. Someone wrote ambiguity into the terms intentionally. The beneficiary has been extracting value from it ever since. He looked at her sideways. Can you close them? I've already drafted the renegotiation terms.
She paused.
I was going to present them tomorrow. Leaf was quiet for a moment, watching his wolves move through their forms in the pale dawn light. Then he turned and looked at her fully, with the direct, unceremonious assessment of a man who dealt in practical reality and nothing else. He nodded once.
Short. Exact.
In another court, in another context, it would have been nothing. Here, from this man, it was everything short of a standing ovation, and Tora understood that perfectly, and filed it in the column of things that mattered. 300 miles to the south, Jonas Henriksen sat in the chair at Tora's old desk, the desk she had not taken, the desk buried under 6 years of organized financial infrastructure, and stared at a reporting system he did not understand. The quarterly variance report had run overnight. He was looking at the output. The numbers did not resolve into meaning for him the way they would have for her, and he did not know where she had stored the translation key, because the translation key existed inside Tora's head, and Tora's head was 300 miles north, behind Frosthold's walls, beside an alpha king who had looked at her like she was already a queen. His pack was bleeding money by the hour. He did not yet know how to make it stop. He sat with that knowledge in the drafty attic room, in the broken chair she had never complained about, and understood, too late, the specific shape of the thing he had thrown away. Chapter 4.
Flaque urgent.
Tora was in the archive when Bjorn, Arvid's senior aide, a careful young man with an organized mind that she had come to appreciate, brought her the notification. She read it once, straight through, without expression. Then she set it down on the reading table and looked at it for a moment. Jonas had accused her of stealing classified territorial maps and treaty documents from the Iron Veil Pack archives. The claim, filed with the North American Wolf Council's Emergency Tribunal, alleged that she had used her position as head archivist to copy and remove protected materials in the weeks before the winter solstice, with intent to provide them to a rival pack authority. The rival pack authority in question was not named, but the implications were structured carefully. Structured, she noted, by someone with genuine legal familiarity, which meant Jonas had hired a council lawyer. The filing was designed to trigger an automatic freeze on any territorial negotiations involving the Northern Realms administration until the accusation was formally resolved. She read it a second time. Then she went to find Arvid. She found him in his study with Commander Leaf and 2 senior council advisors, all of them already aware. The notification had gone to the Northern Realms official address as well, and the room had the particular charged atmosphere of men who had been working themselves toward controlled fury. Arvid looked up when she came in. His eyes went to her face first, reading her. She kept her face calm and informative, the way she always kept her face when walking into a room where decisions were about to be made. He stood. Tora. She crossed the room to him and placed her hand flat against his chest. He stopped. The room went quiet. Let me, she said. A moment. She felt the tension in him. The alpha fury she had seen in the great hall at Iron Veil was present now at a lower register, a contained thing, leashed with the effort of a man accustomed to having the power to simply resolve problems and choosing instead to hold it. His eyes moved over her face. This accusation freezes territorial negotiations, he said. It's targeted. He knows what it disrupts.
He does.
It's reasonably well conceived. She moved her hand from his chest and turned to the table, where Bjorn had already laid out the documentation. The legal architecture is designed for an adversarial resolution. It assumes the accused will defend against the accusation. I'm not going to defend against it. I'm going to dissolve it. Leaf looked at her. The tribunal has a 48-hour preliminary review process. The freeze is automatic until... I know the process. She opened her satchel. I anticipated this. I've been building the counterfiling since the third day I was at Frosthold. Silence. She laid the documentation on the table. 11 days of preparation, organized into 5 clean sections. The technical impossibility of the alleged theft, the access log evidence, the metadata analysis, the provenance chain for every document Jonas had claimed was stolen, and the part she was particularly pleased with, a detailed cross-reference showing that the specific materials listed in the accusation had already been filed in their correct locations within the Ironvale archives as of Jonas's own administrative sign-off date. 3 weeks before the solstice, which meant that either the documents had never been removed or Jonas's own signature had authorized the filing that disproved his claim. She heard Bjorn make a small sound that, from him, constituted visible astonishment. This has been staged, she said. Carefully, but not carefully enough. The materials listed don't exist as a stolen set. They exist as a manufactured list compiled from the Ironvale document registry. Someone went through the registry, identified the most alarming-sounding document titles, and built the accusation from the titles rather than the actual content. Which means no one who constructed this accusation ever had physical access to the documents themselves. Leaf was reading. His expression had done something complex and then resolved into its characteristic flatness. Who helped him file it, he asked. The legal representation is a firm out of the Southern Council District with a history of working for Western PAC interests. She had a separate file for this. She placed it on the table. The firm has filed 7 emergency tribunal claims in the last 3 years on behalf of clients with affiliations to the Western Alpha Coalition. 5 of the 7 were eventually found to lack evidentiary basis. The other 2 settled before tribunal. Arvid was looking at her with the expression she was slowly learning, the one that was more than the professional assessment she was used to receiving, the one that registered her as a specific and particular thing rather than a function. It did the same thing to the new bond every time. She kept her eyes on the documents. How long will the counterfiling take? I can submit it today. The tribunal has a 48-hour processing window for counterfilings with substantive evidentiary packages. Given the quality of what we're providing, I expect a preliminary dismissal within 24 hours of submission. She paused. The territorial freeze will lift with the dismissal. Leaf set down the document he'd been reading. He looked at her with the expression she'd earned from him in the training yard, direct, unembellished, meaning more than its surface. You prepared this before he filed, he said. I prepared it before I left Ironvale, she said. I knew the financial exposure I was taking with me. I knew what the most damaging accusation would be and what the evidence against it looked like. I did not know if he would file, but I knew the counter case, so I built it. Another silence, different in quality from the last. He doesn't know. Arvid said, not to her, half to himself, the tone of a man working something out. That every move he makes, you've already thought 3 moves past. He knew me as someone who organized his events and maintained his records, she said. He didn't watch me closely enough to know what I was doing with the information. She submitted the counterfiling that afternoon. The tribunal's preliminary dismissal came 17 hours later. She was in the archive the following evening, working through the Eastern Treaty language she had been slowly correcting, when Björn knocked and entered with the expression of someone carrying information they'd processed once already and found alarming. "We've had a border report," he said. "Northern Pass, Sector 7. 2 scouts observed an unknown party of approximately 20 wolves conducting what appeared to be a terrain assessment of the approach road."
He paused.
"The party left before our people could intercept, but the advanced scout identified one of the individuals from a previous engagement." Another pause. Tora set down her pen. Drago Vasil was a mercenary alpha, the most effective one currently operating in the Northern Territories, which meant the most dangerous. He hired his considerable gifts to whoever could afford them and asked no questions about intent. The fact that he had been identified surveying the approach road to Frosthold 3 days after Jonas's legal filing had been dismissed meant that the legal strategy had been the distraction, not the primary effort. The threat had escalated from legal to physical. She gathered her notes and went to find Arvid. Chapter 5. It was the night before the council hearing, and Frosthold was quiet. The hearing had been scheduled for 6 days out, a formal proceeding before the Northern Wolf Council to receive Jonas's appeal of the tribunal's preliminary dismissal, a procedural step that would almost certainly go nowhere, given the quality of the counter-evidence, but one that had to be navigated formally. The keep was running at the subdued efficiency of a household preparing for something consequential, and by the time the evening meal was finished and the council advisors had retreated to their respective preparations, the corridors had gone still. Arvid found her on the parapets. She had gone up for the air and the sky and the northern lights, which she had been watching since the first night at Frosthold with the particular hunger of someone who had spent 6 years in an attic with a window too damaged to open properly. They were strong tonight, green and silver moving in slow curtains across the black sky, their reflection catching in the frozen river below, and she was leaning on the cold stone of the battlements, her coat pulled close, watching them move. She heard his footsteps and did not turn. He came to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers, and they stood in silence for a while and watched the lights. "You should sleep," she said eventually. "So should you." "I will." A pause. "The hearing will go as planned. The evidence is sound." "I know it is." "You're not worried about the hearing?"
"No."
She looked at his profile in the northern light, the strong cut of his jaw, the careful set of his mouth, the way he looked at the sky like a man who has seen a great deal of sky and found it reliably honest. "What are you worried about?" she asked. A long silence. The lights moved. Drago crossed the northern pass with 20 wolves and a terrain map.
He said,
"In my experience, men like Drago do not survey terrain they do not intend to use. He won't move before the hearing. The hearing is still Jonas's primary legal lever. He needs to see if it works before he escalates past it. Probably. But the hearing ends in 2 days, and then we know," she said. "Either it's over or it isn't. But we'll know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me something that isn't about the hearing." She considered. The lights moved. Below them, the frozen river caught their colors. "I used to watch the northern lights through the attic window," she said. "The cracked one. The pane was so old the glass had gone wavy, and the lights looked different through it, distorted, like something seen through water. I thought for years that was what they actually looked like." She felt more than saw something change in him, some shift in the quality of his attention. "The first night I was here, when Astrid put me in the south chambers, and I saw the window was real and intact, I went up here instead, just to see them properly."
She paused.
"They were better." "How old were you when you came to Iron Vale?" 14. After my parents died.
A pause.
The pack took me in because I was useful. I understood that clearly. I was old enough by then to understand transactional kindness. He was very still beside her. I got very good at being useful, she said. It felt like the safest possible strategy. If I was useful enough, they would keep me. And then, it becomes something else. It becomes the way you understand your own value. You stop being able to separate the useful from the self. Quiet. The lights. Jonas's rejection confirmed a thing I had been afraid was true for a long time, she said. It was easier to say it to the sky than to his face. That when it came to actually mattering, to someone choosing me without the clause of what I could do for them, I wouldn't be enough. Arvid was quiet for a long time. She had said more than she'd intended, and she was aware of it, and she did not regret it, which was itself an unfamiliar thing. When he spoke, his voice was low and even and carried the weight of something he had thought about carefully. I was going to marry Lady Solveig. Did Astrid tell you? She mentioned her, not the details. Solveig was good, genuinely good, kind, politically astute, brave in the ways that mattered. We had built an alliance that would have served the realm well, and I respected her. I thought that was enough. I told myself it was enough. He paused. The lights moved. When she died, the thing I felt most was a grief for her. Real, true grief. She deserved better, and beneath it, a shame I couldn't fully account for. Because I understood, in the worst possible moment, that I had been planning to marry a good woman I respected while somewhere in the world, this. He turned to look at her, existed. And I hadn't been looking for it, because I had already decided that something reasonable and workable was sufficient. I had already decided not to want more than what I thought I could have. Tora looked back at him. The northern lights moved in slow curtains behind his head. Every person who told you that you weren't enough, he said, was simply not enough themselves to recognize what they were looking at. She held his gaze for a long moment. The bond between them was warm and present and patient, neither demanding nor indifferent, simply there, the way a fire is there, offering warmth without requiring acknowledgement. She breathed in the cold night air. She let it out. All right, she said quietly. It was not a large statement. It was simply the word that means, I am here. I see you. I am not going anywhere. He understood it exactly. She could feel that he understood it exactly, through the bond, like a current between two held points. They stood on the parapets together, shoulders touching, watching the northern lights, green and silver and ancient and unbothered, move across the winter sky. Bjorn's knock came 40 minutes later. They both heard it at the same moment, the brisk, deliberate knock of someone who would not knock if it were not necessary, and Tora straightened against the battlements and Arvid's expression shifted, resolving from the particular openness he had shown on the parapets into the clean, operational focus of a man shifting registers. Bjorn stepped through the parapet door, his face contained but carrying information. The border report is updated, he said. Drago's party has crossed into the northern pass. They're moving under cover of the storm front, and they're not surveying anymore.
A pause.
They've crossed the boundary line. It's no longer a reconnaissance. The physical attack had begun earlier than expected. Chapter 6. The war room assembled in 9 minutes. Tora had timed it because she timed things, a habit she had developed long ago in the context of pack events and catering logistics and the specific disaster management of public gatherings, and which applied, it turned out, equally well to military operations. 9 minutes from Bjorn's knock to a full situation report laid across the central table, Commander Leif in attendance, the 4 senior border commanders patched in via communication link, and Arvid standing at the head of the table with the expression of a man who had done this before and had not yet finished doing it. The picture was Drago's force of 20 mercenary wolves moving through the northern pass under cover of the storm system that had been building all evening, with tactical pace, suggesting a planned arrival at Frosthold's outer perimeter between 2 and 4 in the morning. The border outpost had been bypassed, not overwhelmed, bypassed, which meant either inside intelligence about patrol patterns or an exceptionally good terrain reading, and given the survey operation from 3 days prior, probably both. He's moving for the outer gates, Leif said, tracking the reported positions on the map. The storm cuts our visibility. If he reaches the perimeter wall before we can. There's a secondary breach point, Tora said.
She had not been asked.
She said it anyway because she had spent 4 days reading Frosthold's defensive architecture the same way she read financial documents, for the gap between what the structure was supposed to do and what it actually did, and she had found one. Leif looked at her. Southeast section, the old supply access. The current defensive protocol marks it as sealed, but the sealing was done with a temporary block during the northern renovation 2 years ago. It was listed for permanent reinforcement in the maintenance queue. The reinforcement hasn't been completed. She had the maintenance logs ready. She set them on the table. If Drago has the interior layout, and his survey of the approach road suggests someone gave him building documentation, he will know about the supply access. The room was silent for a moment. She's right, Bjorn said quietly. He had already pulled the building records. The southeast block is temporary. It's been in the queue for 8 months. Leif looked at the map. Then he looked at Tora with the direct, unembellished regard she recognized from the training yard. I need 6 wolves on the southeast axis inside 10 minutes, he said, not to her, to his commanders, but with the tone of a man who has updated his assessment and is acting on the update. And I need the maintenance crew to bring reinforcement materials to that location immediately. Arvid had been looking at her across the table. He looked at her now with the expression she was coming to know as his, the one that held something warmer than professional regard and was not yet comfortable announcing itself fully. I want you in the inner keep, he said. She looked back at him. I want you at the northern border, she said. That's where Drago's primary force is moving. That's where you need to be. She held his gaze. I am not Solveig. I am not something to be protected in a tower. Get to the border. I'll hold the interior. The room was very quiet. Leif, Bjorn, the 4 remote commanders, all of them present to the specific weight of this exchange. Arvid looked at her for a long moment. The bond between them was taut and present and not simple. It was not simple to stand here and choose to send him toward danger, and not simple for him to choose to go, and neither of them was pretending it was simple. The southeast access, he said. You'll seal it personally? I'll coordinate the seal and manage the internal evacuation and keep the communications lines intact so you have continuous situational awareness from the border. I'll have Bjorn with me. She paused. And Leif. Leif looked at her. Then he looked at Arvid. Something passed between them. Not words, not even precisely a look, more the particular communicative shorthand of men who have served together through enough that they can think in the same direction simultaneously. Arvid moved around the table to her. He stopped close enough that the bond rang between them, warm and certain. Stay safe, he said. Quiet, not an order. Simply, the most honest thing a person can say to another person when they are choosing to go toward danger together. You too, she said. He left. She turned back to the war table. The next 4 hours were the most focused of Tora Hevroy's life. She directed the internal evacuation of Frosthold's non-combatants, staff, children, the handful of visiting council members who had arrived early for the hearing, with the systematic precision of a woman who had organized events for 6 years and understood that the difference between a managed situation and a catastrophe was almost always the difference between organized communication and the absence of it. She established 3 communication relays between the inner keep and the border positions, assigned runners to each, and ensured that Bjorn had a continuous channel to Arvid's forward command. At 2:17 in the morning, Drago's force made its move. The primary force hit the outer gate with coordinated precision, not a breach attempt but a sustained pressure engagement, designed to hold Arvid's defenders at the perimeter, while the secondary element moved for the southeast supply access. Tora heard the distant sound of the engagement from the inner courtyard and felt the bond tighten, present, functional, telling her he was intact, and kept moving. The secondary element hit the southeast access at 2:41. They found 6 of Leaf's wolves and a fresh reinforcement barricade and Tora on the far side of it, with a communication link to every defensive position in the keep, calmly relaying situational updates. They held for 22 minutes. Then Drago's force, finding the breach sealed and the primary engagement not resolving in their favor, began to withdraw. By 4 in the morning, the keep was quiet. Arvid came back through the northern gate at 4:30, his armor dark with the weather and his expression carrying the particular controlled exhaustion of a man who has been operating at full intensity and is now beginning to let himself feel it. He found Tora in the courtyard, reviewing the damage assessment with Bjorn, and crossed to her without breaking stride. She looked up when he reached her. He looked at her face, reading her, the way she had learned he always did first, and what was on his face when he found her intact was something she did not yet have a word for but recognized, the way you recognize a thing you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. "The southeast access held," she said. "I know. I had the reports." His voice was rough with the night and the cold and something else. "You're all right." "I'm all right." He nodded. The exhaustion was more visible now, the letting go of the intensity, the body reclaiming its right to be tired. She stepped forward without entirely meaning to and put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own, and they stood like that for a moment in the cold pre-dawn courtyard while Bjorn discreetly studied something on his tablet in the other direction. The siege had broken. Drago had retreated. Jonas's legal strategy stood alone now, isolated and unsupported, and in 2 days they would walk into the council chamber, and she would take it apart piece by piece. Chapter 7. The council chamber of the Northern Realm was a room designed to make you feel the weight of the institution before you'd said a word. It was circular, built of the same dark stone as the keep's oldest foundations, with tiered seating rising from a central floor and the banners of every major northern pack hung from the upper gallery. The acoustics were extraordinary, a voice at normal volume carried to every seat without effort, which meant that silence also carried, and hesitation, and the quality of your breathing when you stood at the floor's center and realized how many eyes were on you. Tora had read about it. She had never been inside it. She walked in on Arvid's arm. He was in full formal dress, the dark ceremonial armor of the Alpha King, the silver wolf of the Northern Realm at his chest, the fur mantle that managed to look less like regalia than like exactly what he was. She wore the dark blue dress, the good one, the only piece of clothing she owned that had been purchased rather than made, and she had added the one thing Astrid had quietly presented to her that morning, a thin silver chain with a wolf pendant, simple and exact, the traditional gift of a Northern Realm alpha to a maid upon their first formal public appearance. She had looked at it for a long time before she put it on. The chamber was full. Every seat in the upper gallery occupied, every council position represented. She recognized faces she had only seen in official photographs. The Alpha of the Eastern Territories, the Southern Coalition delegates, the independent PAC representatives from the mountain regions. They were looking at her the way powerful people look at unexpected quantities, with a careful, watchful assessment that was not yet judgment. Jonas was already present. He sat in the petitioner's position to the left of the central floor, flanked by his legal team, and when she entered, he looked at her with an expression that had several things in it: residual arrogance, uncertainty, something working underneath both of those that she identified, after a moment, as the particular fear of a man who understands for the first time that he is going to lose. Arvid escorted her to the respondent's position. He sat in the Alpha King's seat directly behind her, which meant that when she turned to address the council, he was visible at her back, not standing over her, not performing protective oversight, simply present, available, there if she needed him, and not intruding if she didn't. She had been fighting her own battles for long enough that she knew the difference. The council chair, High Elder Marta, opened the proceedings with a formal recitation and then, with an expression that suggested she had seen enough council hearings to be past theatrical expectation, invited the petitioner to present. Jonas's lead counsel was good. She acknowledged that, privately, he was precise, organized, and had prepared the presentation well given the limitations of the underlying case. He walked the council through the accusation, the alleged theft, the timing, the alleged motive. She had stolen the documents to provide intelligence to the Northern Realm in advance of potential territorial acquisition. He presented the document list, the alleged chain of access, and the reputational case, that Tora was an unranked, unverified individual with unknown loyalties who had been present in the Iron Veil archives for 6 years with unsupervised access to sensitive materials. This part, she noted, was not badly constructed. In the absence of counter-evidence, it would have been plausible. When the floor passed to her, she stood and was quiet for one beat, not from nervousness, but because she had learned a long time ago that the first thing you say in a room like this sets the register of everything that follows, and she wanted to set it exactly right. The accusation rests on 3 factual claims, she said. Her voice carried without effort in the chamber's acoustics. First, that I had the capability to remove the listed documents. Second, that I had the motive. Third, that the documents were in fact removed. I will address these in order, and I will do so briefly, because the evidence on each point is unambiguous. She started with capability. The Iron Veil archive system operated under a physical access protocol she had herself designed 3 years ago. No document above classification level 2 could be removed from the archive reading room without dual biometric authorization, the archivist's credentials, and a secondary authorized signatory. The secondary signatory list for level 3 and above materials consisted of 4 individuals, none of whom were Tora. She had designed it this way deliberately, precisely because she had understood that her access to the materials created a transparency risk, and she had structured it out. The access logs from the 6 months prior to the solstice showed 0 level 3 removals under her credentials. She set the documentation on the council table. The accusation assumes I had unilateral access. I did not. I designed the protocol that ensured I did not. She moved to motive. The territorial maps listed in the accusation covered 4 regions of Northern Iron Veil territory. The Northern Realm already held adjacent territory to all 4 regions and had current survey data that was, in 2 of the 4 cases, more recent than the Iron Veil maps by 2 years. There was no intelligence value in the listed documents that the Northern Realm did not already possess in superior form. The alleged motive, intelligence provision, was structurally incoherent. She set the comparative territorial survey data on the table beside the first set. The documents listed would not have provided the Northern Realm with any information it does not already hold. She paused. I did not steal them, but even if I had, they would have been worthless. A stir in the upper gallery. One of the Eastern delegates leaned forward. She moved to the third point, the documents. The document list in the petitioner's filing was compiled from the Iron Vale Public Archive Registry, she said. It is a list of document titles, not documents. 3 of the items listed have titles that do not correspond to any physical file in the archive. They are registry placeholders for materials that were destroyed in the archive flood of 7 years ago and never replaced. Any search of the physical archive would reveal their absence. They cannot have been stolen because they do not exist. She could hear, from Jonas's table, the sound of his lead counsel making a short, controlled sound. The remaining items have physical counterparts in the archive. Those counterparts were filed, signed, and logged by the petitioner himself on the 22nd of last month, 3 weeks before the solstice. She set the final documents on the table, under his own biometric signature, which means that either the documents were present and filed at that date, in which case they were never stolen, or the petitioner's signature was placed on file documentation for materials that were not present, in which case the evidentiary chain the accusation depends upon was fabricated by the petitioner himself. The chamber was completely silent. The accusation is not inadequately supported, she said. It is affirmatively disproved by the petitioner's own documentation. I would ask the counsel to note the distinction. She gathered her files. She sat down. High Elder Marta looked at Jonas's table for a long moment. Jonas's lead counsel was speaking quietly and rapidly into his ear, and Jonas's face had gone through several colors and settled on something between gray and the resigned pallor of a man watching a structure collapse that he built himself. The counsel deliberated for 11 minutes. The dismissal was formal and total. Not only was the accusation dismissed, but High Elder Marta added a formal notation to the counsel record that the filing appeared to constitute an abuse of the emergency tribunal process and that the counsel reserved the right to initiate a separate inquiry into the evidence of fabrication. There was a separate inquiry. It was that separate inquiry, more than the dismissal itself, that ultimately unraveled everything. Tora was still seated when Arvid stood and came to offer her his hand. She looked up at him, at his face, at the expression that was not performing satisfaction but simply feeling it, with the unhurried quality of a man who has been waiting for something and has seen it arrive, and she took his hand. "My queen has spoken," he said, to the chamber, with the particular economy of a man who understands that some statements do not require elaboration. "The evidence is on record. I trust the counsel will act accordingly." He helped her to her feet. They walked out of the chamber together, and behind them the doors closed on the sound of the counsel already in motion, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Tora Hevroy was not bracing for the next thing. She was simply walking, with her hand in his, through the corridors of a keep that was beginning to feel, with the slow and stubborn patience of real things, like home. Chapter 8. The arrests came on a Thursday morning, 26 days after the counsel hearing. The council's inquiry into the fabricated evidence had moved with a speed that surprised most observers and did not surprise Tora at all. She had provided the inquiry team with a detailed index of secondary documentation on her 4th day at Frosthold, in the same quiet, organized way she had provided everything else, and the inquiry team had needed only to follow where it pointed. What they found, once they started looking, was considerably more than Jonas's filing. High Alpha Eric Henriksen had been systematically diverting PAC funds from Ironvale's lower-ranked members for 11 years. The mechanism was a mandatory contribution structure built into the PAC's territorial tax code, ostensibly a community welfare fund that had, in practice, been directed into a private account under Eric's administrative control. The lower-ranked members had been contributing to their own leaders' personal wealth for over a decade, and no one had audited it because no one had ever had both the access and the independence to look. Tora had had both. She had found it in her 6th week at Frosthold, working through the secondary documentation she had taken from Ironvale on her last night there, not the official records, which were managed, but the maintenance logs and administrative receipts that no one had thought to conceal because no one had thought anyone would look at them. She had built the case quietly, methodically, over the following 3 weeks, and when it was complete, she had given it to Arvid with the same calm, documentary precision with which she gave him everything, and he had read it with the expression of a man looking at something that required significant, controlled fury. He had asked her if she wanted to be present for the arrests.
She had thought about it.
"No," she said. "I want the formal notification sent to me when they're processed. And I want the affected PAC members individually informed of the fund diversion before it goes to public record. They deserve to hear it from a council representative before they read it in a filing." He had looked at her for a moment. "That is going to require significant coordination." "I've drafted a communication protocol," she said. "Astrid can manage the distribution with 2 additional staff. I've already asked her."
A pause.
The expression she was learning. "Of course you have." Jonas Henriksen was stripped of his title in the council chamber on the same day as the arrests, in a brief formal proceeding that Tora did not attend and did not need to. The Ironvale PAC was formally dissolved 3 days later, its territories absorbed into the Northern Realms administrative structure. Its PAC members offered full integration under Northern Realm protections. The formal exile order was quiet, as these things went. Jonas Henriksen, stripped of rank, stripped of territory, stripped of every structural advantage he had spent his life standing on, was transported to the Northern Barrens, the isolated territory at the realm's far edge, the kind of place where a man could survive but not thrive, where the cold was reliable and the company sparse, and the silence had a quality that made most wolves reflect on their choices with uncomfortable thoroughness. High Alpha Eric's sentence was harsher. He would be standing before the council's reparations board for the better part of a year. Tora was in the archive when she received the formal notification. She read it, filed it, and returned to the Eastern Treaty language she had been working on. An hour later, Sigrid arrived at Frosthold. She came through the front doors with 3 bags and the expression of a woman who has spent 6 weeks watching a situation develop from a distance and has reached the limit of watching. She stood in the entrance hall and looked around at the high stone ceilings and the warm torchlight and the organized, purposeful movement of a well-run household, and then she looked at Tora.
"Well," she said,
"This is considerably better than the attic." Tora laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not had occasion for in long enough that the sound surprised her. Sigrid crossed the hall and embraced her with the fierce, unperforming warmth of someone who loves you specifically and has been waiting to tell you so in person. "You're all right," Sigrid said. "I'm all right," Tora said. "Better than all right." She thought about it. The archive, the parapets, the war table and the siege and the council chamber and Arvid's hand over hers in the cold courtyard before dawn. "Better than all right," she agreed. Lady Gunhild came to find her the following evening. She found her in the archive, where she always found her, where Tora had established the quiet order of her natural habitat within a fortnight of arriving. Lady Gunhild stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has spent several weeks updating a significant assessment and has arrived at a conclusion she had not anticipated. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for Wolf. I addressed that when it was relevant. For the way I received you when you arrived." Tora looked up from her work. "I regarded you as an inconvenient disruption," Lady Gunhild said. "I made no effort to understand what you were before deciding what you were worth. That was both inaccurate and unkind, and I should not have permitted myself to continue it past the first week." "You were protecting a structure you'd built," Tora said. "I was protecting comfort I'd grown accustomed to." Lady Gunhild's voice was precise and inflectionless in the way that meant she was being particularly honest. The structure was an excuse. A pause. Tora set down her pen. "I've been told," Lady Gunhild continued, "by Leaf, who said it in approximately 12 words and considered that sufficient, that your management of the keep's internal operations during the siege was extraordinary. I'm inclined to believe him, as Leaf considers nothing extraordinary." Tora allowed herself a small smile. "He told me the training yard formations were good," she said. "I was very moved." Something that was unambiguously a smile moved across Lady Gunhild's face. It was brief, and it was real. She crossed the archive and stood before Tora's desk and looked at her with something direct and genuine and stripped of its earlier calculation. "I was wrong about you, Queen Tora," she said. "Iron Vale is lucky to be in your hands." She paused. "And so is the Northern Realm." She offered a bow, stiff, formal, exact, the kind that costs something from a woman who has been extending or withholding that acknowledgement deliberately for decades. Tora received it with the same quietness with which she received most things, and when Lady Gunhild straightened and met her eyes, what was between them was not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something honest. It would be enough to build on. Chapter 9. 1 year. 1 year to the day, to the hour almost. The deep winter dark already settled over Frosthold, and the solstice torches lit along the great hall's walls. Since Tora Hevroy had stood in the Iron Vale Great Hall with blood on her lip and a clipboard in her hands, and been told she was not enough. The Great Hall of Frosthold held 500 wolves. It held them comfortably, which told you something about the scale of Frosthold's Great Hall. It was hung with the banners of every major northern pack, many of them newly joined under Northern Realm protection in the wake of the Iron Vale dissolution, and the torches burned bright, and the fires burned hot, and the crowd had the particular quality of energy that comes from an assembly of powerful people who are feeling something they didn't entirely anticipate and are deciding how they feel about feeling it. Tora stood in the antechamber off the Great Hall's west wing and breathed. Sigrid was there. She was always there. She had settled into Frosthold with the cheerful inevitability of someone who belongs somewhere and knows it, straightening the hem of Tora's gown with focused attention. The gown was deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver at the sleeves and collar, chosen by Astrid and adjusted by the keep's seamstress, and absolutely nothing like anything Tora had ever owned before. It fit in a way that her clothing had never quite fit, not because it was expensive, though it was, but because it had been made for her specifically, which was different. "You look like a queen," Sigrid said. "I'm told that's appropriate for the occasion." Sigrid looked up at her. Her round face carried everything. The 6 years of knowing her, the attic, the broken window, the night of the rejection, all the months since, and also none of it, because what was on her face right now was purely the present tense. "You always looked like a queen," she said. "We just didn't have the right room for you." Tora pressed her hand briefly, firmly.
She breathed.
The doors opened. Astrid was waiting at the entrance to the great hall, carrying the crown on a dark velvet cushion. It was beautiful in the way that very old things made for a specific purpose are beautiful. The Luna Queen's diadem of the Northern Realm, obsidian and braided silver, the metalwork dating back 300 years to the first queen of the line. Tora had seen it in the archive records, photographs, provenance documentation, the formal descriptions filed at each crowning, and she had understood it intellectually as an object of significance. Standing before it now, she understood it differently. This was the thing that had been waiting. Not for her, specifically. It had waited for 3 queens before her, but with the patient, particular readiness of a purpose that knows it will eventually be fulfilled. She walked into the great hall. The 500 wolves went silent the moment she crossed the threshold, not at a signal, not at a command, simply in the instinctive, collective way of an assembly that has arrived at a shared understanding. She walked the length of the hall alone. Arvid was at the far end, standing at the head of the room in the Alpha King's formal position, and she walked toward him through the silent crowd with the straight spine and steady gaze of a woman who had spent a year learning that she was exactly enough and had begun, slowly, to believe it. The bond was warm and present and quietly, completely certain. She stopped before Arvid. He looked at her. She knew every version of his attention now, every register, and this one was the version she had no name for and did not need one. The version that simply said, "You." Astrid stepped forward. She lifted the diadem from the cushion and held it for a moment, the obsidian catching the torchlight. "Tora Hevroy," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall. "Fated mate of Arvid Solberg, Alpha King of the Northern Realm. You have been tested by fire and ice, by legal shadow and physical siege, by the judgment of courts and the suspicion of those who did not yet know you. You have answered every test with the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself." A pause. "By the ancient right of the Northern Realm, I name you Luna Queen." She placed the crown in Tora's hair. The great hall of Frost Hold Keep bowed its head. 500 wolves, warriors, nobility, council delegates, the allied packs newly absorbed under Northern Realm protection, bent their heads as one, slowly, with a particular quality of an acknowledgement that is not commanded but chosen, not formal but felt. The sound of it was like a tide going out, like a held breath released. Tora stood at the center of it and felt, for the first time in her life, no urge whatsoever to make herself smaller. Arvid leaned down toward her. His voice was quiet enough for her alone. "1 year ago, a foolish boy told you that you weren't worth standing beside him. Tonight, the most powerful wolves on the continent are kneeling at your feet." She tilted her head up to look at him. "I know," she said. Quiet. Even. Entirely herself. "I've been thinking about that." He looked at her and smiled. She had learned the registers of his expressions over a year, but she had only seen this one a handful of times. Unguarded, unhurried. The smile of a man who is simply and completely happy in a specific place at a specific moment. It transformed his face in the way that genuine things transform the faces they live on. She smiled back, and the hall around them rose. Far away in the northern barrens, in a small cold house at the edge of the realm's most isolated territory, Jonas Henriksen sat in the dark and could not feel his wolf. The disconnection had come gradually, not a violent severing, the way the mate bond had severed, but a slow recession, the pack sense fading over months as the ties that connected him to other wolves had one by one gone quiet. He had been stripped of his rank, stripped of his title, stripped of the pack itself, and without those things the wolf in him had grown very still, the way a fire grows still when there's nothing more to burn. He thought about the girl in the steel gray dress. He thought about the clipboard and the broken window in the attic room and the way the financial reports had been organized on the desk she had not taken. He thought about the moment in the great hall when the torches died and the doors blew open and everything he had been so certain of had turned to smoke before his eyes. He would think about it for the rest of his life. He thought about it now, in the cold dark of the Barrens, while 300 miles north a great hall full of wolves bent their heads to a woman he had called worthless, and the Luna Queen's crown rested in her auburn hair, and the Alpha King of the Northern Realm looked at her like she was the most important thing the world had ever managed to produce. It was cold in the Barrens. It would be cold for a long time. Chapter 10. 6 months after the crowning, the Northern Realm was unrecognizable. Not in the way that things are unrecognizable when they have been violently remade, not disrupted, not dismantled, not replaced with something foreign. Unrecognizable in the way that things are unrecognizable when they have been allowed, for the first time, to be fully what they were always supposed to be. The structures were the same. The stone was the same. The people were largely the same. But the thing that moved through them, the particular quality of a place that knows what it is for, and is doing it, that was different. That was new. Tora's financial reforms had passed through the Northern Realms Council by a margin that surprised everyone except Tora, who had spent 4 months building the cross-pack coalition that made the margin possible and had known the numbers before the vote was called. The reforms were not radical. She had never been interested in radical, which tended to produce theater more than change, but they were structural. Fair trade agreements that closed the extraction clauses the Eastern dealers had been exploiting for decades. Restructured logging contracts that allocated yield value to the territories providing the resource rather than the middlemen processing it. A transparency council with elected Omega representatives and actual authority to audit, not merely observe. 3 Alpha councils in the Southern Territories had formally requested her advisory guidance. She had accepted 2 of them and declined the 3rd because the 3rd's existing treaty structure had problems that would require their leadership to genuinely cooperate with change rather than manage its appearance, and she had looked at the leadership and concluded they were not yet ready for that. She had written them a detailed letter explaining exactly what they would need to do before she could be useful to them, and offered to revisit the inquiry in a year. Leaf had been present when she drafted the letter. He had read the final version over her shoulder and made a sound she had come to identify as his version of approbation. "You told them to fix themselves," he said. "I told them what they needed to fix if they wanted outside assistance to be effective. There's a difference." A short pause. Not much of one. "No," she agreed. "Not much of one." The old archive wing had been expanded. This was Tora's doing. The archive had been chronically underfunded and understaffed. The accumulated records of decades of Northern Realm administration housed in conditions that she had immediately identified as both organizationally inadequate and environmentally damaging to the older materials. She had requisitioned the renovation budget, overseen the climate control installation personally, and hired 4 new archivists with the particular combination of organizational intelligence and genuine curiosity that she looked for in the people she worked with. The expanded wing was, by her own admission, her favorite room in Frosthold. This was not a secret. Arvid had pointed out, on more than one occasion, that she spent more time in it than in any of the staterooms, including the one she had been given expressly for administrative work. "That's because this one has better light," she told him. "It has the same light. It faces the same direction. The windows are bigger. He had looked at her for a moment and then, very quietly, smiled. Bjorn had, over the months, developed the habit of appearing at Tora's door at irregular intervals with the expression of a man who has encountered something requiring guidance and has learned, through repeated experience, that the guidance available from this source was reliably superior to any other option. On a Tuesday in late spring, he appeared with a report from the Council's Omega Rights Working Group and an expression that was doing something complicated. The Southern Coalition's representative, he said, has proposed an amendment to the Transparency Council Charter that would limit Omega representative authority to advisory capacity. She looked up from the Eastern Treaty Review she had been finalizing. Which representative? He told her. I see. She set down her pen. Schedule a meeting with their leadership delegation for Thursday. I'd like to discuss the proposal directly before it reaches the floor. What should I tell them the meeting is about? Tell them it's about the amendment. She paused. Tell them I'd like their reasoning and that I'll bring mine. It will be a productive conversation. Bjorn had learned, over 6 months of service, to identify the specific quality of Tora's calm that meant a problem was already 40 steps past where it currently thought it was. He recognized it now. He noted it. He wrote down Thursday. The evening light moved across the frozen river, thawing now, the first cracks of spring running through the ice, and the sky above the keep's north tower was doing something extraordinary with the clouds, the light catching them from on a warm evening in late spring. She and Arvid sat on the parapets. They had developed a habit of this. The parapets in the evening when neither of them had anything that required presence at the formal dinner table, the cold stone and the sky, and the particular unhurried quality of time when you are not managing it. Arvid had a report he was reviewing. She had a letter she was drafting. They were companionably present in the way of two people who have learned each other's silences and find them comfortable. Bjorn had told her 3 weeks ago that she was the only person who had ever made the Alpha King laugh. She had received this information neutrally and had been quietly pleased by it ever since. Below in shades of copper and rose that were purely accidental and would last only minutes. She watched it. The Southern delegation meeting on Thursday is going to be productive, she said. That's a very particular way of putting it, Arvid said, without looking up from his report. Is it? When you describe a meeting as productive before it has happened, it means you have already determined the outcome and are giving the other party an opportunity to arrive at it themselves. She considered this. That's a reasonable summary, she allowed. He looked up then, looked at her with the expression she had no name for, the one she no longer needed a name for, the one that simply said, You were never too small. He said, The world just hadn't caught up to you yet. She looked at the copper light on the thawing river. She thought about the attic and the wax paper and the broken window and the clipboard and the cold drafts and the 6 years of being indispensable and invisible simultaneously. And she thought about this, the parapets, the evening, the keep that had become home, the bond that hummed warm and certain and completely itself between them. I know, she said simply. And she did. Tora Hevroy had gone from a discarded, unranked archivist to the most powerful Luna queen the Northern Pax had ever seen. She had done it one document, one decision, one quiet act of devastating competence at a time. Hard karma had come for Jonas in the cold, quiet darkness of the Barrens. And Tora? Tora had inherited the North.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.